Who you become matters more than what you get. It was the summer of 1982 in a small town just outside of Kansas City. The kind of town where people knew each other by name, where the corner diner still served coffee for 50 cents, and where the rhythm of life moved at a pace just slow enough to hear the crickets in the evening. In that town, a young man named Robert Miller lived with a heart full of ambition but a wallet that always felt far too light. He was 22, fresh out of community college, and filled with the kind of fire that made you believe anything was possible. Robert had always believed that success meant having more. More money, a better car, a bigger house. He kept a vision board in his room with pictures of mansions in Malibu, sleek sports cars, and watches that cost more than most people made in a year. His dream was to become a wealthy entrepreneur. To many, it seemed like a stretch. He had no capital, no connections, and no formal business training. But what he did have was relentless energy and the kind of curiosity that kept him up at night reading books about business, psychology, and leadership. One hot July morning, Robert decided to attend a business seminar in Wichita. It was hosted in the banquet room of a Holiday Inn and led by an older gentleman named Harold Jennings. Harold wasn't flashy. He wore a plain brown suit, used overhead slides instead of fancy projectors, and spoke with a slow drawl that reminded Robert of his grandfather. But what Harold lacked in showmanship, he made up for in substance. During a break, Harold walked by Robert, who was sitting alone near the refreshment table, nervously thumbing through his notes. Harold stopped, poured himself a cup of coffee, and sat down beside him. "Tell me, son, what is it you're chasing?" Harold asked with a soft grin. Robert replied without hesitation. "I want to be successful. I want the money, the lifestyle, the freedom." Harold nodded, took a sip of his coffee, and leaned in just a little. "Let me tell you something that took me 30 years to learn. Success isn't about what you get. It's about who you become in the process." At first, Robert didn't quite understand. It sounded like one of those philosophical sayings that made sense only when you were older or had nothing left to chase. But Harold saw the confusion in his eyes and continued. "You see, I used to want all those things too. I started a small appliance repair business when I was 26. I worked 12-hour days, 6 days a week. Eventually, the money came. So did the new house, the nice car, even a vacation home up in Colorado. But none of those things made me proud. You know what did? It was the discipline I developed waking up at 5 every morning. The patience I learned dealing with angry customers. The courage it took to take out a loan and risk everything. The humility to admit when I made a mistake and start over. The generosity I practiced by mentoring younger guys like you. That's who I became. That's what matters." Those words stuck with Robert long after the seminar ended. He went back to Kansas City and looked at his vision board, and for the first time he realized it was incomplete. It showed what he wanted to get, but nothing about who he needed to become to get there. That night, he took it down and replaced it with a list. Not of things, but of qualities. Integrity, resilience, discipline, gratitude, courage, compassion, leadership. He wrote each one with a red marker and pinned it above his bed where he could see it every morning when he woke up. Over the next 10 years, Robert started his first business selling refurbished office furniture. It was rough in the beginning. He made barely enough to cover rent. He had to take part-time jobs delivering pizzas and mowing lawns just to keep things afloat. But he kept going. He worked on himself more than he worked on the business. He read every book he could find. He took speech classes to improve his communication. He volunteered at a local shelter to learn humility and service. He even began waking up at 5 just like Harold had. Eventually, his business took off. Not because he found a magic formula, but because he had become the kind of man who could run a business with wisdom and grit. Customers trusted him because he was honest. Employees respected him because he listened. Partners sought him out because he brought value, not just profit. By the time Robert turned 35, he had achieved many of the things on his original vision board. He had a thriving company, a beautiful home, and the freedom to spend time with his family. But what made him most proud wasn't any of that. It was the man he saw in the mirror. A man who had earned not just wealth but character. Who had learned to lead with his heart, not just his head. who had discovered that becoming was greater than getting. And yet, Robert's story didn't stop there. Because life, as it often does, had more lessons to teach. In the spring of 1997, a fire destroyed one of his company's warehouses. It was a huge financial loss, and it threatened to undo years of progress. There were insurance delays, vendor issues, and dozens of employees suddenly unsure of their futures. Old fears came creeping back in. Maybe I wasn't cut out for this after all, he thought one night, alone in his office. But then he remembered Harold's words. It's about who you become. So he stood up, walked to the whiteboard, and wrote 3 words in big, bold letters. Show up strong. The next morning he met with his team. Not with empty promises, but with honesty and a plan. He reassured them they would get through it together. He opened up temporary positions in other departments to keep people working. He personally visited every client who had been affected to explain the situation and offer alternatives. Some left. Most stayed. Because by then, Robert had built not just a business but trust. And trust is the currency of character. Months later, the warehouse was rebuilt. New systems were in place. And the company was stronger than before. Not because of luck or strategy, but because Robert had become the kind of person who could weather storms without losing his center. Years passed. Robert started mentoring young entrepreneurs, just like Harold had done for him. He never charged a fee. He simply asked each of them the same question Harold once asked him. What is it you're chasing? One of those young men was named Elijah Reyes. Fresh out of college, full of dreams and doubt, Elijah reminded Robert a lot of himself. They met every Thursday at a small coffee shop near the city park. Robert never lectured. He told stories. He asked questions. He challenged Elijah to write his own list of the person he wanted to become. In one of their meetings, Elijah asked, "How do you know when you've become the person you were meant to be?" Robert smiled. "You don't. Not exactly. But you'll notice that the things you used to chase start chasing you. Opportunities, friendships, peace, meaning. Because who you are attracts what you get. And if you keep growing, there's always another level waiting." The sun was setting as they left the cafe, casting long golden shadows across the sidewalk. Robert walked a little slower than he used to, his hair now more silver than brown. But his eyes still held that same fire. A fire not born of ambition, but of purpose. And that fire was far from extinguished. Because the journey of becoming never really ends. There was still more to teach, more to learn, more to become. And so, the story continues. The following spring brought with it a gentle renewal of the earth. Blossoms returned to the trees lining the avenues of Kansas City, and the streets pulsed again with life after the long hush of winter. For Robert Miller, now approaching his late 50s, the season symbolized something deeper. Not just growth in the world around him, but a reaffirmation of a principle that had guided his life for decades. The constant unfolding of who we are becoming. Elijah Reyes had been visiting Robert for nearly 2 years by this time. No longer wide-eyed and uncertain, he was now running his own digital consulting agency. It was small but promising. He had 5 employees, a modest but growing client base, and a vision that burned brightly inside him. Yet with growth came new problems. Unreliable vendors, late payments, a team member who betrayed his trust. It was life in its truest form, messy, unpredictable, and at times, unforgiving. One evening, Elijah showed up at Robert's house. He wasn't scheduled to meet him that night, but something had pushed him to drive across town anyway. Robert welcomed him in without a question. They sat in the backyard under a wide oak tree whose branches had grown thick and wise with the years, much like Robert himself. "I feel like I'm losing myself," Elijah admitted, the words coming slow and heavy. "I started this company because I wanted to make a difference. But now all I do is put out fires. I feel like I'm constantly reacting, not building." Robert nodded, letting the silence hang in the air for a moment. "Let me tell you a story," he said. "One I haven't shared with many people. It was 1985, just a few years after I started my furniture business. Things were beginning to take off, but I was still living with the fear that it could all disappear overnight. One morning, I had a meeting with a potential investor, a man who could have helped me open 3 new locations. I needed that deal badly. I prepared a 30-page proposal, rented a hotel conference room. I even bought a new suit. He never showed up. Robert paused and chuckled, not bitterly, but with the wisdom of hindsight. Turns out, he'd changed his mind the night before and decided not to tell me. I sat there for 3 hours before I accepted it. Drove home feeling like a complete failure. That night, I started packing up my desk. I thought maybe I just wasn't cut out for it. But then something strange happened. My neighbor's boy, maybe 10 years old at the time, came over and handed me a thank you note. I had helped him and his mom move some furniture the week before. The note said, "Thanks for being the kind of man my mom can count on." Robert looked up at Elijah, his eyes soft. It hit me like a brick. That moment reminded me that I wasn't building a business. I was building a life, a reputation, a legacy. That child didn't know how much money I had in the bank. He just saw the kind of man I was. Elijah listened in silence, the weight of Robert's words settling deep into his chest. It wasn't just about solving problems. It was about who he was while solving them. Integrity wasn't tested when things were going well. It was tested when nothing made sense, when everything seemed unfair. That night, Elijah drove home with a new clarity. He made a few difficult decisions in the weeks that followed. He let go of a lucrative but toxic client. He sat down with his team and opened up about his struggles, inviting them to help co-create the future of the company instead of carrying it all on his shoulders. He even took a weekend off, something he hadn't done in over a year, to hike through the Ozarks with his younger brother, reconnecting with a piece of himself he had buried under ambition. And slowly, things began to shift. Not because the world changed, but because Elijah had. He had stepped into a deeper version of himself. One that valued presence over pressure, people over performance, progress over perfection. Months later, during a local entrepreneurship awards ceremony, Elijah was asked to give a speech. He stood at the podium in front of 100 young dreamers, and he began with a question. What if success isn't something you chase? What if it's something you grow into? He told them about Robert, about the vision board that once held mansions and cars, about the man who had learned that real wealth is built in the unseen, the choices, the character, the quiet acts of courage that no one claps for. He ended the speech with a line he had scribbled in his journal just days before. The world is moved not by those who get the most, but by those who become the most. The room fell into a hush. It wasn't the kind of line that made people jump to their feet. It was the kind that lingered, that haunted people in a good way, that followed them home and whispered to them in the silence between distractions. And as the applause slowly began to rise, Elijah looked to the back of the room where Robert sat quietly, a small proud smile on his face, and nodded. Robert's own journey continued. He had become a mentor to more than a dozen young entrepreneurs, each one shaped not just by his knowledge but by his presence. His home had become a kind of sanctuary, a living library of lessons carved not from books but from bruises. He planted a garden that year, not for vegetables but for reflection. He often said tending the soil reminded him of the inner life, slow, patient, and deeply responsive to how you treat it. On one of those early summer mornings, with the sun just starting to crest over the horizon and the dew still clinging to the petals of his lilies, Robert sat on his porch and began writing a letter. It wasn't addressed to anyone in particular. It was more like a legacy letter, something to leave behind. It began like this: if you ever feel lost, remember this simple truth. Who you are becoming is always more important than what you are getting. Success might bring you comfort, but becoming will bring you peace. Wealth may open doors, but character will keep them open. And when your days are fewer than they were before, you'll measure the worth of your life not by what you owned, but by who you were in the quiet spaces, when no one else was watching. He paused, then continued writing. So become kind, become strong, become someone others can count on, become wise, become humble enough to learn and bold enough to lead. Because the world doesn't need more people chasing what glitters. It needs more people becoming what matters. And still, his story didn't end. Because somewhere, someone else was about to walk through his front door. A young woman, or a confused father, or maybe someone who thought they had failed for the last time. And Robert would be there, to remind them, the journey is not in what you get. The journey is in who you become. The summer heat settled over Kansas City like a warm blanket, casting a golden hue on every sidewalk, rooftop, and park bench. In the heart of this city, the old neighborhood where Robert Miller lived remained a quiet refuge from the noise of the world. His garden was in full bloom now, the lilies standing tall beside the sunflowers, and the scent of lavender drifted lazily through the morning air. Life around him moved in its familiar rhythm. Buses came and went, children laughed as they rode their bikes past the gates, and the birds kept their daily symphony alive from the trees. One afternoon, as Robert sat beneath the old oak with his journal open and a half-drunk cup of tea cooling on the table, a knock came at the gate. He looked up and saw a young woman standing there. She was tall, mid-20s perhaps, with a purposeful stance but eyes that betrayed a storm of uncertainty. She carried nothing but a leather-bound notebook pressed tightly to her chest. "Are you Robert Miller?" she asked. "That depends," Robert said, standing slowly with a light grin. "Are you here to sell me something or ask me something?" She hesitated, then stepped forward. "My name's Grace. My brother Elijah sent me. Said if I ever felt stuck, lost, or ready to give up, I should come find you." Robert's face softened. He waved her in, offered her the seat across from him, and poured her a fresh cup of tea. Grace was a painter, not just a hobbyist, but a passionate, classically trained artist who had dedicated most of her young life to capturing human emotion on canvas. She had lived in New York for 3 years, trying to make it in the world of gallery exhibits and private showings. But things hadn't turned out the way she'd hoped. Rejection after rejection, months where she had to choose between groceries or paint supplies, and critics who said her work was too emotional, too raw, not commercial enough. She had returned to Kansas City quietly, staying with her parents, her dreams packed away in a storage unit and her hope buried beneath layers of shame. Robert listened, not interrupting. When she finished, he leaned back in his chair and looked at the sky for a moment before speaking. "You know, Grace, my first shop failed. Not many people know that. I opened a second-hand furniture store right on Main Street. Worked my hands raw, painted the windows myself, stayed open late every night. And after 9 months, I had to close the doors. Not because I didn't work hard. Not because I didn't care. But because I was trying to sell what people didn't want instead of building something people didn't know they needed." Grace frowned slightly. "What do you mean?" Robert smiled. "I realized I was just copying what other people were doing. Selling what the big chains were selling. But I didn't start the business because I wanted to sell furniture. I started it because I loved creating spaces that made people feel at home. So I stopped trying to compete with big stores. I started building custom pieces, talking to people, listening. I became less of a seller and more of a maker." Grace nodded slowly, her fingers tracing the edge of her cup. "So I should just start over?" "No," he said gently. "You should start true. There's a difference. Starting over is about forgetting the past. Starting true is about learning from it." She opened her notebook then, flipping to the middle. There, in vibrant strokes of charcoal and ink, were pages of faces. Some joyful, some broken. Each one haunting in its realism. They weren't the kind of pieces you'd see hanging in a posh gallery with champagne and polite applause. These were real people captured in their most honest moments. A woman weeping in a hospital bed. A father holding his newborn. A teenager staring into a mirror, unsure of who she was becoming. "These are stunning," Robert said softly. "And they matter, because they don't just show a face. They show a life." For the next hour they talked. About the purpose of art. About fear and rejection and the quiet revolution of showing up anyway. Robert didn't give her a plan or a checklist. What he gave her was belief. Not the kind that shouted, but the kind that lingered. That filled the silence between her doubts with something stronger. Grace began painting again. Not for galleries, but for people. She started a small project called Portraits of the Everyday, where she painted people in her neighborhood, barbers, teachers, nurses, bus drivers, and wrote the stories of their lives beside the images. She posted them online, not for fame, but to remind others of their worth. Within weeks, her work went viral. Not because it was perfect, but because it was real. Back in Robert's garden, the seasons began to turn once more. The sunflowers bowed their heads in the coming of autumn, and the air carried the crisp scent of change. Robert received a letter in the mail one morning. It was from Grace. She wrote, "You didn't just help me believe again. You helped me remember who I was before the world told me who to be. I'm not chasing galleries anymore. I'm building a gallery of truth. Thank you for showing me that becoming isn't about fame. It's about impact. It's about living the kind of life that leaves a mark even after the paint fades." Robert folded the letter and placed it in the same wooden box where he kept Elijah's note and the child's thank you card from decades ago. He didn't keep them as trophies. He kept them as reminders that a single conversation could redirect the course of a life. That legacy isn't built in monuments but in moments. And just as before, the story did not end. Because the gate would knock again, and someone else would walk in. A man struggling with addiction. A young teacher doubting her calling. A retiree wondering if his best years were already behind him. And Robert would be there. With tea. With time. With truth. Because he knew in his bones what few people ever truly grasp. That the most powerful thing you can ever become in this life is someone who helps others become. The wind swept gently through the trees, carrying with it the murmurs of autumn. Leaves rustled in a gentle hush, painting the sidewalks in brilliant tones of amber, crimson, and gold. Kansas City was preparing for the colder months, but Robert Miller's home remained a place of warmth, not just from the hearth inside, but from the steady flame of wisdom and presence he carried with him. By now, his story had begun to ripple far beyond the boundaries of his neighborhood. Word had spread, quietly, organically, that there was an old man on Chestnut Street who didn't just offer advice, but listened without judgment, who had lived through storms and come out not bitter, but better. Robert didn't advertise, didn't post his reflections online, and didn't try to brand his life into something sellable. Still, people came, and he received them all the same, with patience, curiosity, and a sense of unshakable calm. One rainy Thursday morning, a visitor arrived who didn't knock at the gate or wait politely on the sidewalk. He simply stood in the rain, drenched from head to toe, eyes vacant, like someone who had just escaped a fire without realizing he'd survived. Robert spotted him through the front window and came out with a large umbrella. "Son, you look like you've been through hell. Come in and sit for a while." The young man didn't speak until he was seated, a towel around his shoulders, a warm mug in his hands. He was in his 30s, thin but wiry, with eyes that had seen too much too soon. His name was Marcus Dean, a former Marine, a husband once, and recently released from prison after a 5-year sentence for assault. He'd come back to the city with nothing but a duffel bag and a head full of guilt. What haunted him most wasn't what had been taken from him, but what he had lost inside himself. He no longer recognized the man in the mirror. They sat in silence for a long time, the only sounds the ticking of the old grandfather clock and the soft hum of rain on the roof. Robert didn't rush him, didn't ask invasive questions. Finally, Marcus spoke. "I keep thinking, maybe the best thing I can do is just disappear. Nobody needs me. Not anymore." Robert took a slow sip of tea and set his cup down gently. "Let me tell you something, Marcus. Years ago, I had a friend named Harold. Vietnam vet. Came back home and couldn't hold a job for more than 6 months. Drank too much. Got into fights. People gave up on him. Hell, he gave up on himself. But there was one thing he did better than anyone I've ever known. He fixed broken things. Radios, watches, cars, anything with a heartbeat of machinery. He said he liked working with things that were already broken. Said it made him feel like he still had purpose. One day, a local foster agency's van broke down across the street. Harold fixed it in the rain, took 5 hours. Never asked for a dime. The director came over and asked if he could teach the teens at the shelter some basic mechanics. 2 months later, they gave him a part-time job. A year after that, he had trained over 30 kids. many of whom went on to become certified techs and mechanics. Some of those boys said Harold was the first man who ever showed them what strength looked like without fists. Robert leaned forward, his gaze steady. You think your life is over because of what you've done. But maybe, Marcus, just maybe, your story matters not despite your pain, but because of it. Broken things still have worth. Sometimes, they're the only ones who know how to fix other broken things. Marcus wiped his eyes, but not out of shame. It was the kind of cry that comes when a person feels seen after years of being invisible. The next few weeks, Marcus came back often. Not because Robert had all the answers, but because he never pretended to. They worked together in the garden, replaced the old fence, and eventually began to refurbish some of the donated furniture Robert had stored in the garage. It was Marcus's idea to start something new. He called it the restoration table. A workshop space for ex-offenders and veterans to learn carpentry and craft skills, all while being mentored and supported. They didn't just rebuild furniture, they rebuilt dignity. The first open house drew dozens of people. Some came for the craftsmanship. Others came to support the mission. And many came simply to feel hope again. Robert, now nearing his 70s, often sat in the back of the shop during these gatherings. He didn't say much. He didn't need to. His presence alone reminded them all what Elijah had once discovered, what Grace had felt in her return to painting, and what Marcus now carried forward. That becoming is never about erasing the past. It's about redeeming it. One afternoon, a man walked up to Robert and introduced himself as a journalist from a local magazine. He had been following the quiet ripple effects of Robert's life and wanted to do a feature story. He had already spoken to Elijah, Grace, and Marcus. He said it was unlike anything he'd ever seen, this slow revolution of becoming, sparked not by noise or fame but by one man choosing to invest in others with nothing more than his time and his truth. But Robert, smiling, waved off the idea. I'm flattered, he said, but I'm not the story. They are. I just reminded them who they were when the world tried to make them forget. The journalist nodded, understanding more in that moment than any article could convey. And still, the gate would swing open again. A high school senior who had just lost his father and didn't know how to carry the weight of being the man of the house. A single mother who wanted to return to school, but feared she had waited too long. A retiree who, after 35 years in one company, felt terrified of the silence retirement brought. Each one came with their questions, their wounds, their wonderings. And Robert listened. Sometimes he offered stories. Sometimes just his quiet presence. Because he understood the sacredness of becoming. He understood that to help someone reclaim their worth, you didn't need to be extraordinary. You only needed to be willing. Willing to sit with the uncomfortable. Willing to believe in the unseen. Willing to offer your life not as a stage, but as a bridge. And so the story continues. Not because it is grand, but because it is good. Because the world doesn't need more noise. It needs more people who live in such a way that others remember their own light. And Robert Miller? He had become one of them. Not by accident. Not through brilliance. But through choice. A daily, deliberate choice to help others become. Winter arrived in Kansas City in a hush, laying a soft blanket of snow over rooftops, trees, and sidewalks like a painter's final brushstroke. The city slowed down. Cars moved carefully over icy roads. Smoke rose steadily from chimneys, and the sun hung lower in the sky, casting longer shadows by mid-afternoon. The old oak in Robert Miller's garden stood bare now, its once vibrant leaves scattered and gone. But even in the stillness of winter, something deeper had taken root, something invisible yet undeniable. Robert's home had become more than a residence. It had become a place of quiet transformation, a sanctuary tucked within an ordinary street, marked not by a grand sign but by a simple wooden bench beneath the tree where many had once sat, and many would still come to sit. Over the years, his story wove itself into the fabric of the community, not through fame, but through presence. Through the patient, persistent power of being there for someone when the world had turned away. That winter, as the year drew to a close, Robert's health began to waver. It wasn't sudden or dramatic, just a quiet slowing down. He walked a bit more carefully, rested a bit longer in the afternoons. And he wrote more, pages filled with memories, with lessons, with stories he had never told, as if preparing to leave behind a map for those who would come after. He never complained. He never withdrew. He just made more time for reflection and chose his words even more deliberately. One evening, as snowflakes drifted lazily against the windows, a group of familiar faces gathered in Robert's living room. Elijah came with his son, now a teenager, taller than his father and full of that same curiosity Elijah had once carried. Grace brought a new portrait to gift him, one she had painted from memory. A peaceful scene of Robert in his garden, tea in hand, a thoughtful smile on his face. Marcus arrived last, his coat dusted with snow, carrying a small wooden box he'd crafted himself. Inside was a compass. On its lid, he had carved the words, asterisk, for those who help us find direction when we've lost our way. Asterisk. Robert laughed gently, overwhelmed by their kindness, though his eyes glistened with tears. Not tears of sorrow, but of gratitude, of knowing he had lived not a perfect life, but a purposeful one. They sat for hours that night telling stories, not about success or wealth, but about second chances, quiet bravery, and the unexpected ways people heal each other. They remembered the awkward first meetings, the doubts, the breakthroughs, and they all agreed on one thing, that they had not just been helped by Robert, they had been changed by him. That night, as the others left and the fire dimmed, Robert sat at his window, watching the snowfall. In his journal, he wrote what would be his final entry. Asterisk, to become is not to arrive. It is to keep becoming. To live in such a way that others grow just by knowing you. I was never trying to build a legacy. I was just trying to be faithful with the day I was given. And somehow that was enough. Asterisk. Robert passed peacefully in his sleep a few weeks later. The city didn't mourn with parades or headlines, but the neighborhood felt it. The way a tree feels the loss of its roots. The way silence feels after a familiar voice is gone. In the spring, they planted a tree in his honor in the community garden. Beneath it, a small stone with simple words etched into its surface. He helped others become. And that spring, the work continued. Grace opened her own studio where she mentored young artists from underfunded schools, giving them a place to be seen and heard. Marcus expanded the restoration table to 3 more cities, focusing on helping veterans reintegrate with dignity and skill. Elijah started a weekend program for young boys growing up without fathers, offering them guidance, meals, and someone to believe in them. They didn't do these things for Robert. They did them because of Robert, because what he had given them could not be undone. It had moved into their lives like sunlight into a room, quiet, steady, irreversible. And new people came, new questions were asked, new hands reached out, and those once helped now became the helpers. Because in the end, the true mark of a life well lived is not what we build for ourselves, but what we build into others. Robert Miller never sought to be remembered. And that is exactly why he always will be.